Hello, I'm Mary Soderstrom, and I want to tell you a story. In the summer of 1968, my husband and I loaded up our VW Beetle and immigrated to Canada. We were young, we were distressed about the war in Vietnam, and we were hopeful that we'd find something different across the border. But to be honest, we didn't expect things to be too different. Weren't Canada and the United States pretty much alike? True. Lots of people spoke French in Montreal, where we were headed, and beer had a higher alcohol content. Both of those things we thought were great. But other differences came sharply into focus even before we entered Canada at Windsor. We had arrived in Detroit on the Sunday of Labor Day weekend, about the time the sun came up. We had driven all night for reasons that don't belong in this story. It was too early to present our papers to Canadian officials, so we got off the freeway to look around. What we saw were deserted streets lined with burnt-out buildings and piles of rubble left over from the riots of the summer before. It was devastation of a sort we had never seen, and when eventually we made it downtown, we were still shaken. To make the best of the situation, we went to the nicest hotel we could find to eat breakfast and to wash up a little, having driven all night. The breakfast was good and the welcome cordial. It helped that a professional baseball team was in town to play the Detroit Tigers, and my husband, with his crew cut, might have been a ball player. That also made us feel good. But then when we left, we found a black man with a sleeping bag over his shoulders crouching next to a shopping cart just outside the hostel's grounds. He was homeless, probably, something I hadn't encountered before. He got up quickly and took off when we approached. The contrast across the border couldn't have been greater. Windsor was cleaner and had no burnt-out buildings that we could see. Folks were polite in the working-class neighborhood where we stopped to buy provisions for lunch. "Pardon me?" the young man behind the counter asked when he didn't catch what we'd said. "Sorry," said someone else as he brushed past us on his way out. Of course, we would soon learn that slavery had been legal in Canada until the 1830s, that generations of Indigenous Canadians have suffered from genocidal policies, that prejudice continues against people of color, and that homelessness would become commonplace. Yet by the time we reached Montreal on the afternoon of a hot, muggy Labor Day, it was clear, Toto, that we weren't in Kansas anymore. Why, I wondered. Why, indeed, were there two Vietnams at that point? Why, I asked myself later, were Vermont and New Hampshire so different from each other? Then as I learned more about my new country, I tried to figure out how Saskatchewan could produce Tommy Douglas and Alberta Stephen Harper. Obviously, in each case, a boundary separates the political entities. Usually, it reflects geography. The Connecticut River separates Vermont, the home of Bernie Sanders, from New Hampshire, the live free and die state. Live free or die state. In Vietnam, the boundary was also natural. The Ben Hai River, just north of the Hai Van Pass, through a spur of the mountains that extends into the sea. On the north side, cold winds from China blow in winter, while south of the pass, the weather is much warmer. Sometimes, though, the boundary is arbitrary, like the one between Alberta and Saskatchewan, which literally is just a line on the map. The one between the United States and Canada is a combination of both kinds. This probably looks familiar to you, but it dates from 1755. This copy is marked with red lines made over several decades following its publication. At the top, the cartographer drew straight lines indicating, can you see that? The difference between the land which was claimed by the Hudson's Bay Company and the French possessions. He also carefully delineated the boundary set out in various treaties between European powers. The map served as a reference by all sides during the boundary talks between the United States and those responsible for British North America. You can see various propositions and other lines drawn on this copy. This map is called, I think it's The red line map, and it was presented to George III, and a copy of it is at Southern Maine, University of Southern Maine. Anyway, the boundaries suggested were based on river courses, the height of the land, and where little had been mapped by Europeans, lines of latitude. What would have happened had other lines been adopted? The St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers had been suggested as boundaries at one point. And certainly if that had been chosen as the boundary between British North America and the United States, Ottawa as a national capital wouldn't be here. What else would be different? Would a Canada based on peace, order, and good government have developed? We have no way of knowing. What is clear is that once boundaries are determined, people use them to their own ends. Things change. Vietnam has been one country for more than 40 years. Alberta had a brief flirtation with the NDP. Both New Hampshire and Vermont voted against Donald Trump in 2016. And many, many things have happened in the US and Canada over the last 240 years that have resulted in them diverging, not converging, on many important cultural and social and political points. And then there's a present-day case of the Ottawa River. How many of you noted that you'd entered another province when you crossed it today? Okay. How many know that both sides are part of the Canadian National Capital Region? Yet the river might still be, a boundary between Canada and an independent Quebec. What happens will depend on how people on the two sides act in the future. As I said, at the beginning, I wanted to tell a story. It's clear that we have not reached its end. Like all stories about boundaries, it is one that is to be continued, or as one says in Quebec, à suivre.